I just wanted to make this delivery much more of a communication interface with language. In other words, while I want to look at the varieties and also look at what is considered as standard English, and then how these coexist, and how between these two, as learners, as users, as people who reproduce the language, people who create the language, we all contribute to a process which involves simultaneously something which draws us to the center and some things which take us away from the center. I will use some words I sent to people and centrifugal, will come back to that later. So essentially what I'm trying to do with this particular presentation is to look at the notion that there is only one English, or there is the notion that there is only one correct English. The notion that if you know the particular correct English, you will achieve everything you want in terms of career, in terms of social relationships, and so on. And so in other words, an idea that validates, that makes this particular central provision of English very privileged. Education is a part of that. I remember one of my students who did a master's in English language a few years ago. He wrote a dissertation on Botswana variety of national English. I remember one example that he gave in that particular dissertation. It seems in the University of Botswana, Gaborone, they insist on standard English. The department wants you to write only in standard English. Anything other than that, anything where you bring something from some of the local languages, local usages, are not seen as valuable. So there is this anecdote, this particular incident where a student submitted an essay about English, description of English, and then he included a few words which were borrowed from some of the languages used in Botswana and submitted it to the department. And so he got it back from the department, and he was expecting an A or something, very high grades for that. But he was surprised that they returned it so soon, before the actual date for getting the grades. And he opened the assignment, and then he said, and it said, with some red marks, resubmit in English. So in other words, whatever he used was seen as something not English, although it was perfectly acceptable from a linguistic point of view. So what we are talking about is attitudinal aspects, attitudes to language. Now, to what extent do we have to take these into consideration? Not only to safeguard ourselves from being victims of that, but also not to create victims ourselves. So in other words, the point that I want to make, the central point I want to make, is that we should be comfortable with the variety that we're using, as long as that particular variety is able to communicate, is able to convey what you want to say, in the way you want to say, and the way you want it to be conveyed. So it is an act of communication between the person who speaks and the person who listens, the person who gestures and the person who sees, and the person who awaits a particular form of communication to the person who is ready to receive a particular communication. So it is a communication process. And who are the best learners in this particular communication process? We'll come back to it, why children are much better than others in learning a new language. But before we go any further, there's one particular author, a scholar, who has come up with this particular diagram or this particular model. And this model is very important because this has defined English studies for almost 30 or 40 years. It's not not very difficult to see why, but it is also important to see why. It's important because when he published this about 30 years ago, English was very much influenced by this idea of a particular standard English as the correct one. But then, being based in the United States, he comes across people from different parts of the world, and he had to make some sense of that particular variety, that particular complexity, that particular non-standard aspects of language. So he came up with this particular diagram. His name is Kachru, Professor Kachru. You have the reference. All the references I'm going to give will be on your Brio, so I want you to really concentrate on the argument and then see, and that is important because you're going to get the references, and the references I'll be giving, I will check, and I have already checked, everything is available in the library, so you can borrow and use. So I'm making sure that you're making it easier for you, simpler for you, and in a way guided in some ways, so that you're able to go to key texts which are already available in the library. But these days you can get a lot from the internet and so on. So let's look at this particular diagram, this particular model. He uses this, there are three concentric circles, three circles here. The center circle, he calls it the inner circle, and then there is the outer circle, and then there is the expanding circle. So what we see here is that in the inner circle, let's put USA and UK. In other words, English is, in this particular case, right in the center. These are the countries where there are what one might call native speakers of English, and these particular people set the tone, set the changes, and the language described, language capturing the particular development in these particular areas, provides the inner core of the language, so to speak, in the core of its use rather than the language. So USA, UK, and then he uses the second circle, it's called outer circle, where language is used, but language is also not in the same way as in the center, but in a way which is institutionalized. In other words, in Nigeria, for example, or in India, for example, the courts use English. In Nigeria or India, for example, again, there's two examples, but there also you can use Kenya, you can use Bangladesh, you can use Sri Lanka, you can use any of those particular countries, which will come to see what lies behind the particular categorization. So the categories, the one is in the circle, the second is the outer circle, and the outer circle, the key aspect is that the language is institutionalized. The variety is institutionalized. You can talk about Indian English. You can talk about English being used in a variety of domains, and therefore that particular area is called outer circle. And the third one, which is China, Russia, Brazil, you can include a whole range of other countries. And the third circle, we call it expanding circle. In other words, these are the areas where English is still expanding. It has not acquired the status that it has in India or Nigeria. And this particular diagram is quite simple and usable, and that's why it has survived for this long. The idea that you can categorize language users based on geography and also based on history. So the two overlapping areas that the overlapping criteria that underlie this particular thing are geography as well as history, but largely geography. In other words, this goes by countries. So there are countries which are specified. So you can talk about Indian English, you can talk about Singaporean English, you can talk about Nigerian English. So in other words, it sort of tallies, it maps on to existing political divisions or political entities, and therefore it's much easier to talk about Nigerian English and so on. And that's one simplicity of this particular diagram. So therefore, it has lasted for a long time. But then it also has been criticized by different scholars who felt that this particular categorization is useful, but it could be more refined, more sophisticated. Partly because if you map onto history, onto this particular history of the development of language, of the way English being spoken in one part of the world to several parts of the world, then we see that this particular diagram may need refinement, let's put it this way. Say, for example, the outward movement of English from Britain has taken place in two waves, so to speak. One wave where English people from England or Britain as such, or UK as such, went and settled in countries like South Africa or countries like Australia or Canada or United States. So they took the language with them. And the people who came after that, whether they came from Holland or whether they came from Scandinavia or whether they came from Italy, they started adapting to the language that already existed. So English is the major language in the United States, not because everybody who went to America came from the UK or England, but it is the first language which established itself as a major vehicle for communication, and that's why anybody else coming Italy and it becomes a more accepted variety. And same in the case of Australia. And so you find that the first wave of movement out of Britain, I'm using these words synonymously, but they all indicate that people move from British Isles to these particular areas. So Australia and the United States form one category or historical period when English moved from UK to areas which were largely uninhabited, so to speak. Again, you can't say uninhabited because Australia had people before people came a few centuries ago, and the same with the United States. But it is the dominance, that particular group which went from here that it acquired, that along with the particular dominance is the dominance of English. So Native American languages or Aboriginal languages did exist and do exist, they coexisted, but certainly within this particular picture, you could say that this particular movement, this particular wave, this particular historical phase when English moved from England to other areas is very significant. But at the same time, you also find that in the, so in other words, some people would say that you should actually make another circle right in the center, which would be UK. And then America, Australia should be another circle within a circle. But let's leave that for the time being. So in other words, it's the outward expansion of English, and that is very important. And in this particular outward expansion of English, the key, the central idea, or a core language, so to speak, a language whose description would form what we call English, is a key to this. Then what about this second movement, so to speak, or second wave, so to speak? The second wave came with the colonization of different countries, different parts of the world, and colonization in Africa, colonization in India, and other areas. So the movement from there to some of these countries is again slightly different. So the key to understand here is that to understand this particular process is that when English arrived there were already developed languages and there were more people who were using that, and therefore using a policy of what one might call indirect rule. In other words, using the existing structures, whether they were chiefs or whether they were nawabs or maharajas, you were using those particular structures. English reached a point where it becomes a very key position. It requires a key position, partly because of the power which backed English. In other words, it was the language of the colonial administration, but also because it was a language of neutrality. So in other words, it did not give special benefit to any particular group, and therefore it had a certain neutrality, and then that particular prestige plus neutrality meant that English was more easily acceptable. But at the same time, its acceptance was slightly different, because there are existing varieties, existing linguistic heritage, there were oral traditions, there were written traditions, there were a huge range of literatures in this